appreciate being here. Yeah, so I'm not Zaid. I'm going to be presenting on Zaid's behalf here. Zaid couldn't make it due to some travel complications. Let me just make sure I know what's happening here. But we also have a poster on this material that'll be up this afternoon as well. So I'm going to try to stick to the notes more than I usually would. I would probably just wing it, but I'm going to try to kind of do Zaid some justice here and go through the talk the way that he has set it up. Language, as we think about it in Uri Hassan's lab, our group at Princeton, is used as a vehicle for communication, a way to transmit our thoughts from one brain to another. This is a very fundamentally kind of social process. For example, I have some kind of meaning encoded in the patterns of brain activity that are, privately, contained within my brain. To get this to you, to convey this kind of meaning to you, I need to encode these thoughts into some kind of observable linguistic behavior, like English speech here. And that is going to be received by you, and assuming that you are an English speaker as well, and because we have a lot of shared experiences with the world, you're going to be able to decode this linguistic signal and reconstruct something of the meaning that I wanted to convey to you privately inside your own brain. So in everyday life, this kind of situation is typically occurring in conversations, and it's just important that's not how we often study language in neuroscience, but there's something special about conversations. For example, Herb Clark argued that conversations are the most basic form of language use. They don't require any special skills like literacy. They're easily learned by children. It's universal across human societies. Garrod and Pickering also argue that dialogue is easier than monologues in some sense because it allows people to interactively kind of align their representations. This kind of alignment process from a neuroscientific perspective, we call this brain-to-brain coupling. So I'm going to give you an example here of brain-to-brain coupling. Imagine a speaker saying something like, "I want to be famous," okay? If we have access to the neural activity of both speaker and listener, we can start by simply correlating these brain signals, something like intersubject correlation. This is a data-driven method for quantifying how much speaker-listener coupling we're seeing in a conversation like this. And prior research has shown, for example, that the closer the listener is coupled to the speaker, the more they kind of are able to understand of what the speaker is trying to convey. One limitation to this kind of coupling metric, though, is that it's completely content agnostic, right? It can't really tell us what information is encoded in the brain activity. It can tell us how much is shared or where there is something shared, but it can't really tell us explicitly what is shared. So we want to try to start explicitly modeling what is actually shared. How can we do this? We can think of the measured brain activity at a particular voxel as some kind of weighted sum across some set of latent features. You could, and this is sort of the vector representation that I'm showing here. You could imagine these might be stimulus features, or you might think of them as like patterns of activity across neurons in a population here. If we knew these features, we would already have kind of solved the problem. We don't know what these features are, so we need to start developing hypotheses as to what these features might be. So we can do this with explicit models. We might use a simple model here. We might code, for example, phonemes in this phrase, "I'd want to be famous," right? So we encode the phonemes as vectors, and we can see how well they sort of map onto the brain activity, how well the model captures brain activity in the speaker, and then ultimately we want to be able to see how well does this brain activity generalize, or does this model generalize to the listener. So this is not actually going to be a very good model, right? This is a very low-level model. It only really captures some particular aspect of speech. So how can we better model this kind of linguistic content, the meaning encoded in something like a real-world conversation, or like the kind of thing that we're doing right now? And so we're lucky to be living through this period where we suddenly have these models that really capture a lot of the rich contextual structure of natural communication. And so large language models can provide us a sort of an explicit computational basis for modeling language. They learn in a kind of interesting way from the sort of social world that we live in, from our language, and they can represent a lot of the richness of context unlike any previous generation of model. So recent work from our lab and others has shown that these embeddings learned by LLMs better predict brain activity than any previous generation of model. And so now that we have a pretty good model, we can use this model to predict the speaker's brain activity during natural speech production. And the critical test is whether that exact same model trained on the speaker's brain activity can generalize and predict the listener's brain activity as well. So we developed a hyperscanning paradigm to study this. So we have dyadic pairs of human subjects simultaneously in the scanner having largely unconstrained conversations. These conversations are prompted, but they are almost completely spontaneous. This is data collection in collaboration with Diana Tamir's group at Princeton as well. So we have 30 total dyads here. Each was presented with a topic prompt, something like, would you want to be famous? And the dyads had 3 minutes to freely discuss each prompt. They had a sort of pass the mic button that allowed them to switch back and forth, right? So you can see subject A here speaking in blue while subject B is listening, and then they switch roles. And this goes on across 10 different topics over the course of 5 scanning runs. So we have this audio recording of the interactive real-time speech happening here. We have the accompanying neural activity in both of these interacting brains. What kind of features do we want to use to model this process? And so here we use a variety of different feature spaces simultaneously here. The first set is very low-level kind of nuisance regressors capturing the structure of the task itself. The second is this low-level acoustic spectral properties of the signal. The third is articulatory phonetic features like place of articulation. And finally, the feature set of interest here are these word embeddings, contextual word embeddings from a large language model. And so we can fit all of this model jointly using banded ridge regression and then generate predictions for each of these submodels. So the first result that I'm going to show you here is the within subject encoding performance using these large language models with all of these other variables accounted for in the model fitting. So this is prediction performance generalizing to left out scanning runs, left out topics and conversations. And we generate predictions from the model and we correlate those predictions with actual brain activity here. So you're seeing correlation values. And so on the right, you can see the orange. This is comprehension. This is similar to work by Alex Huth. This is really, showing us that these models can capture a lot of the language network when someone is listening to natural speech. The blue plot here is during spontaneous speech production. And so you can see that the model captures language network quite well during speech production as well. That was actually a little bit of a surprise to us. We think that's pretty exciting. How good is this model, right? So we can very simply compare this to other models. Here we fit these models completely separately. And just keep an eye on the color bars here, right? So we look at these acoustic models, these articulatory models. They all capture something of the language network, but these contextual embeddings from the large language model dramatically outperform these other models. Okay, so this is all within subject, though, within speaker and within listener. This is not really the exciting part yet. What we really want to do is see how well these models trained, for example, in the speaker's brain, generalize to the listener's brain. That is how well both the speaker and listener are aligned to an explicit set of features that we can capture with our model. And so we call this approach model-based coupling. This is how it works. We fit a model in a subset of runs to predict the speaker's brain activity. And we can evaluate that against the speaker's brain activity like I previously showed you. But simply, we can also generate predictions for the left out data and evaluate those predictions from the speaker's brain against the listener's brain. Okay? And this is really telling us basically how well the speaker's model generalized, the explicit speaker's model, the weights that we learned from the speaker generalized to the listener's brain activity. So this is the main result that I'll show you here. We were kind of surprised to see this map. I was expecting this to just be more language network, but it turns out that the features that are aligned, it turns out that the brain areas that are aligned across from speaker to listener like this extend a bit beyond the language network. It's kind of surprisingly right lateralized here. We don't really have a good story for that yet. And you see this extending into temporal cortex, but also into posterior PSTS and TPJ, and also medially into precuneus and things like that. So this is maybe a kind of extending from the language network into areas more associated with social cognition. So this is voxel by voxel. How well does the speaker's brain activity, as we can capture it with this model, how well does this model trained on the speaker's brain activity generalize to the listener? Of course, I'm making a lot of simplifying assumptions here, right? This is just voxel to voxel, same voxel in my brain to the same voxel in your brain, and at lag 0. So just as a preview of how actually complicated this is, how much work we have yet to do here, we can start actually looking to see how well these models generalize across brain areas, like my somatosensory cortex talking to your early auditory cortex, for example. That gets complicated, and we also start to see that different pairs of brain areas are not actually completely synced up at lag 0. There's also some kind of temporal structure there that I won't be able to get into today. Okay, so I'll just finish with a kind of core argument here. We think that conversations basically allow us to kind of interactively navigate a shared meaning space, right? That is, I have a sort of set of, I have thoughts in my brain, you have thoughts in your brain, and we're going to behave at each other, listen to each other, and to try to align those thoughts to some extent. And something that's really interesting is that we think that these large language models are also converging to some extent on the geometry of this shared meaning space. So we can use this kind of model-based coupling framework, position these large language model embeddings as an explicit model of the shared linguistic features, the shared linguistic content that is transmitted from the speaker's brain to the listener's brain in real-world interactive conversations. Okay, so I'll thank Zaid in particular, who did all of this work, and our collaborators with Diana Tamir's group, and of course, Uri, the PI, on all of this, and thank you all for listening.
Thanks a lot. I want to go back to the last talk briefly, because there was one question for Ursula. Can you speak a bit about how 1 to 3 year olds were scanned successfully? I assume they weren't sedated. This is true. Ursula answered via email and said they were asleep. So this is the answer. There's one question for Sam. The callosal sulcus seems to consistently show up. What's the function there?
Say that again?
The callosal sulcus.
Yeah, there's some medial areas there that are probably we're just not modeling well. And we see some like visual areas too, right? So I think a lot of that is just we spent months trying to kind of like capture head motion and the structure of this task and really make sure that that's not driving what's happening here. But I suspect there's still some of that leaking into what we see.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful talk. So I want to comment on the last slide.
Mm-hmm. Maybe
before you have a brain image, I think isn't that the frontal parietal control network? So you commented on that the spatial pattern extends beyond language network, but isn't it frontal parietal?
Yeah, there does appear to be contributions from frontal parietal here. I don't know exactly what the explanation for that is. I mean, people I think are also planning what they're going to say, you know, as they're listening to someone else, and there's a sort of turn-taking structure that probably also demands some kind of attentional recruitment. But
yeah, and I also want to comment on Uri Hassan's last recent Nature review paper. Mm-hmm. It seems to say that the shared meaning space is represented in the default mode network, but it's not showing that. So
yeah, I mean, some of what we're seeing here could arguably be called default mode, but it's not. Yeah, this is not coming out as like an obvious default mode sort of thing here. But I think that this is, you know, what we're seeing here is only what the large language model can capture, right? Which is some linguistic structure, some meaning, but it's not everything, right? Like I don't think that the embeddings from GPT-2 or something like this really fully capture the kind of like theory of mind processes and things like that that are probably happening in actual conversation. So I suspect there's plenty of extra shared meaning potentially in default mode areas, right, that we're just not going to be able to get at with a relatively simplistic model like this.
Can I interpret the differences you got? Sorry, the last one.
Please.
The differences you got is because the model you use are different. That's why the results are different.
Yeah, and yeah, I think we use intersubject correlation, like this kind of content agnostic method, to try to get at something, what is shared without any model, right? We don't know what is shared, right? So we can use something like intersubject correlation to get at a sort of a data-driven sense of what is shared, right? And that has shown up in default mode areas and things like that, right? But a strictly linguistic model like this is not going to capture all of that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, there's one more question that I was also wondering about. Can you speculate on the right lateralization?
Yeah, I don't have a good explanation for that. The really nice story would be that we are very fixated on left lateralization because we don't actually study language in conversation a lot of the time. We don't study meaningful conversations that people are having with each other, and maybe the right plays a more important role in that. But other than the sort of simplistic story of maybe this is keying a bit more into like social cognition areas, I don't have a good explanation yet. We tried to get rid of it. Like we modeled this in a variety of different ways and tried to convince ourselves that this wasn't a real thing, but we haven't. Yeah, so it's still there.
Thank you for this great talk. I have two quick questions. One is, beyond the right lateralization, do you have any hypothesis for this what seems like negative coupling in the motor cortex, and if you think it's some sort of inhibition why the other person is speaking? And my second question is, have you tried any other method than voxel to voxel correlations by trying to maybe map like the functional regions instead of like looking at more like anatomical relationship, but like trying to map first the functional regions within each person and then try to see if these functional regions relate to each other?
Yeah, we don't have, Diana collected these data without really like language as a sort of the main thing in mind. So we don't have nice like language localizers for these. But we're doing the best that we can. We do group them according to like Ev Fedorenko's language network and try to look at that scale as well. But it's not as nicely sort of like individualized as we would really want it to be. So we're certainly losing something there. And the issue, yeah. So we see these. This negative prediction in motor cortex. That's a weird thing to see, right? When you're generating model-based predictions, it's in some sense says that your model is saying the signal should go up when in fact the signal is going down, right? And we also see a sort of anti-correlation between the weights that the model learns between speaker and listener in these motor areas. I don't have a great explanation for that. I do think there's something complicated going on there that we're just not modeling well, having to do with the sort of feedback signals that the speaker might be kind of like, they're doing motor articulation and they're also hearing themselves speak, and there's a sort of weird loop to that, right? That a lot of other people have studied in more detail. But I suspect a lot of it is also just the timing, right? So again, this is just lag 0, and so it might just be that we're not kind of looking at the right. Like there might be a sort of like when my motor cortex is going up, right? It's at a particular timing that yours is going down or something like that, right? Systematically. And so I think if we look at the timing in more detail, we can hopefully get a better idea what's going on there.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's all the time we have for question. Our next